This is Cold Start.
You know, we were chatting with Uncle Strick, and he came over here from Colorado, and he had this really fancy vehicle he'd been sporting, this like 20-year-old Escalade that was beaten to all hell, and he said he was thinking about getting out the Sawzall and cutting the roof off of the thing.
Oh, wouldn't that be a good time? Yeah, short wheelbase Escalade from the early 2000s, no roof. Sounds like a party, which is the Uncle Strick way, right?
Absolutely. And it got me to thinking, like, it's a convertible, but you don't really see like four-door convertibles or SUV convertibles hardly ever, right? And wait a minute, is there even a name for that? Well, it turns out there is. And back in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, there were these cars that they used this a lot in. And so imagine those old carriage-style coaches, very many of which had a soft top. And the idea is those soft tops would sort of retract back and they would create an open-air cabin for everybody to be in. And this was in a two-door or a four-door car. And the term that they came up with that was landaulet, like Landau, but with like L-E-T at the end, a little French. And actually, not that long ago, Mercedes, through Maybach, recently released a G650 version of the G-Wagon, Landaulet. It was essentially a G-Wagon with the soft top.
Interesting. And so was that G-Wagon a four-door or was it still a two-door?
It was a four-door convertible, a Landaulet. And a Landau itself, before the Landaulet was created, was one of those large four-wheel carriages with the soft top. So Landaulet got kind of converted over when they went into proper, road cars the way we know them today, SUVs, and they call those Landaulets.
Well, because I've heard the term cabriolet, and I feel like a lot of people have, of just like a standard convertible. But these carriages back in the day, it kind of makes sense of like a four-door convertible. Like I've seen those before. Like we've seen those things back in the early 1900s. But nowadays, yeah, a four-door convertible, it doesn't really exist. An SUV convertible sounds like just an idiotic idea. I mean, they've happened, right? We can't forget about the Nissan Murano Cabriolet, which I think they did call it a cabriolet.
And that PT Cruiser,
and there was the Land Rover Evoque convertible as well.
Right, yeah.
All these very unusual cars, but it's interesting that there's a specific term for a four-door SUV-style convertible.
And it's interesting that you mentioned cabriolet because, of course, the cab in cabriolet referred to, the cabin, the area in which people were riding. And that cab is also used in what we think of taxis. The name for taxi, we think of taxi cab.
Uh-huh.
The official name, the entire name for that is taximeter cabriolet.
But it's not convertible.
But it was the cab, and that's what they called it. So a little confusing, a little bit of overlap in these terminologies. And there was a Landau roof as well. So we had the Landau, the cabriolet, the Landaulet, all of these things sort of mixing it up. And the Landau roof, that was something that came along in like the 60s and the 70s. And that's any kind of textured material on the roof of the car that's permanently affixed to the roof. So
not convertibles.
No.
We're not talking about movable roofs anymore, but like textured fabric roofs.
Yeah,
they're fixed.
So in the 70s, we saw a lot of these cars into the 80s with a vinyl roof or a fabric roof.
Okay.
Right? So that sort of textury look to the top of the car, and invariably they all wore terribly. Like over time, those things age very poorly on cars. The vinyl roofs, they would crack, they would discolor. The fabric roofs would kind of act like convertible roofs, like you see on old convertibles. They don't look so great.
Yeah, which, I mean, a fabric roof is an interesting thing in and of itself. But yeah, I kind of remember that period in Americana of the 80s cars where there'd be like the half third of the roof would be a different color, a different material, maybe trying to look like those old coaches back in the early days.
I think it was the aesthetic, yeah. In 1978 or 79, I remember my dad had a Pontiac Grand Prix that was like this brilliant blue, like a royal blue color with a white vinyl roof on the thing.
Now that screams royalty to me.
Oh man, just class all the way.
And didn't they used to have like those like port windows too, like the little circular windows in the back as well?
Yeah, I think in the 80s, I remember that in the Chrysler TC, which was that Maserati mix-up that they did. It was the Chrysler LeBaron convertible that they added those little porthole windows to. Not too shabby.
Great styling choices all around.
Well, they did call it the Malaise era for a reason, right? And then there's another variation on this, which my dad also had, which is called the Continental kit. So this comes from back in the 30s, Henry Ford's son, whose name is Edsel, which I'm not sure a lot of people know, the car that came later that's considered like the ugliest car ever made was the Edsel, right?
Yeah.
Henry Ford's kid, Edsel, went over to Europe and was super blown away by the styling of all the luxury cars over in Europe. They just look really different than, the Model T. So he went back to his designer and he said, can you build me a custom Euro-inspired vehicle? And I want it to have a long hood and a short trunk, and I want you to put a spare tire and mount it to the trunk on the outside. And that's how they came up with the 1939 Lincoln Continental. And from that styling is sort of carried over to today, where they keep the spare tire on the outside of the back of the car. We see this in a lot of SUVs for function, but in this case, it was all for style. And a bunch of aftermarket companies started selling Continental kits because this was so popular. And my dad, here again, in 1986, had a Mercury Cougar XR7 in this kind of silver color with the Continental kit. And the Continental kit was like a navy blue roof with a navy blue fabric wheel cover on the back of the trunk. And it had wire wheels.
Oh, of course it did. It had to.
Yeah. Chrome, wire wheels, blue fabric, silver car. 1980s, man. 1980s.
Styling.
Yeah.
Owning the streets back in those days.
Absolutely.
I think it was interesting of Edsel going over to Europe. He basically wanted like an international look. He wanted a European styling. And it's funny that back then they called those things like, continental. Like it's from the other side of the sea.
From the continent, from Europe.
Right, which normally today would just be like, oh yeah, give me like a, Euro international look, something like that. Maybe it could have been called the Lincoln International, and then that could have been like the new styling thing. But I guess back then, the European roadsters of the time, they put the spare tires on the rear. And so they put it on the trunk. And I guess like back then, spare tires were a really common thing to have on the vehicles. And so like sometimes they put them in the trunk, but then obviously that would take up all of your trunk space. So it wasn't very usable in that aspect. And then some manufacturers were like, we'll put it on the side of the vehicle. And so like you'd have it on the left side or the right side of, kind of towards the front. And then for whatever reason, the Europeans decided to put it on the rear on the trunk. And then he went over there and was like, all right, that looks different. That looks like unlike what we usually do over in the States. Let's do something like that.
And we've totally lost sight of the fact that roads were not what we think of today. Like the roads were really rough, often rutted, often dirt or gravel. Flat tires were a really common thing. And tire technology, bias plies were all that there were at the time. There was no such thing as a radial tire, a steel belted tire, any of that kind of stuff.
I guess that's true, yeah.
So changing your tire was something that you had to know how to do until, pretty recently, right?
I would say that a lot of the new generation has no idea how to change a tire. But
not even
I guess
close.
back then it would have been more commonplace that you needed the spare tire. Where nowadays, like you're saying with the SUVs, you just like having the spare tire on the back because it makes you look utilitarian. I don't know, that you're going to go off-road, that you might need the spare tire.
It looks rugged.
Most of the people that own those, especially like G-Wagon owners that have the spare with the cover and all that sort of stuff, it's like, if they get a flat tire, none of the owners of those G-Wagons are ever going to remove the spare tire off their car and replace it. It's just not happening.
Most of them have probably never touched a tire, but it makes sense. If you think about that era, think about that old Mercedes SSK Roadster we talked about, the one that raced at Le Mans. It was like that Roadster. This is exactly that style.
Yeah.
So Edsel saw that, came back and said, all right, spare tires on the back, everything. Let's go. Come on.
That's the way to do it. It'll be way cooler. And then, and once again, like the Lincoln Continental, because this is called a Continental kit, the Lincoln Continental wasn't the first one to ever do it. They weren't like creating this innovative new design, but they're the ones that made it super popular. And then, people that had their whatever other cars would go to these aftermarket places and be like, hey, make mine look like the Continental. Give me that Continental kit.
It's amazing how much influence we really took from Europe when it comes to cars, right? Our most American of cars, the thing that we think about JFK and, right, the Lincoln Continental. And then what's the other big car brand name that we have? Chevrolet.
Right.
How French.
Hey, don't make it sound non-American now.
Chevy. All right, so more German design. So there's this dude named Wunderbald Cam. Okay, what a weird name. Wunderbald Cam was this auto designer and engineer back in the early 1900s. And he came up with this body design that had sort of a sloping, like a downward sloping roofline, and the rear deck that was really short and abruptly ended. And it abruptly ended like with a vertical plane. And we've seen a lot of cars in modern times with that sort of shape, but it was sort of a new design at the time. And it turned out that this was aerodynamically a huge advantage over the existing designs that they were using at the time. And it reduced turbulence at high speeds. And the style of bodywork with that sloping rear and the very sudden kind of straight line back, they've come to know that as a camback or comeback or a camtail car.
What would be some examples of a camtail?
How about a 1970s, like a 240Z? Think
Oh,
about that
It's
sloping
kind of like a
back.
teardrop.
Yeah, it like
design.
slopes to the back, and then the rear of the car is effectively like a vertical line.
Uh-huh.
Right. And it's just very abrupt the way it sort of drops off. And I guess that's really good for aerodynamics. There's been some other cars that are nowhere nearly as storied as one of those. In the 70s, they made a Ford Pinto wagon, and it kind of emulated that same sort of look, which was kind of weird, really ugly. There's some old Ferraris I could think of, or old race cars that I'm just picturing that have that sort of straight back, and I'm having a hard time. Like, was it the 250 GTO?
So, I mean, like, this was... I never knew that this was called something. Like, that this was a styling design of, like, going from the roof, that the rear glass was curved, and it goes to kind of the rear of the car, and then it just, like,
Vertical.
cuts off.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, wait, maybe there are other ones that are like this.
Would the Shelby Daytona Coupe be an example of this?
Yeah, I think so.
The aerodynamic reiteration of what would have been the Shelby 427, but they put a roof on it.
That's right.
And the rear of it is almost like, it looks like someone took a knife and like sliced a piece off of it.
Yeah, but even like the old Vets back in the split window days, or the C6 and C7 Vets are kind of like this too. Sloping back and then a very sudden kind of vertical drop at the rear of the car. Yeah, just chopped off.
Interesting. So yeah, I didn't even know that this was called something. You would have think like, oh, it's just a way to like shape a car, but I guess someone had to be the first person to come up with this shape.
Yeah, now that I kind of think about it, the Toyota Prius is one of these. Absolutely. Wah, wah. So, German influence in design, we've had lots of different things there. As a big BMW fan, I think there's one that's very well known in BMW circles, but probably nobody's heard of that outside of that. Do you care to share that one?
Yeah, I guess, would it be the Hofmeister Kink?
Exactly.
Which BMW almost lost their way with this, and this was like a bunch of us BMW nerds had our, arms up in the air because the latest design BMWs lost the Hofmeister Kink, and it used to be this very iconic piece amongst the vehicles. Now, what is a Hofmeister Kink? It's essentially a shape in the rear window glass. It's kind of how, you go past the window for the driver, you go past the window for the rear passenger, and the way that it slopes down, it's like this very specific kind of loop back design, and it just always has been the silhouette for BMWs for the longest time.
Yeah, to me, I picture the 6 Series, like the 635 CSI, as sort of emblematic of that kink. It had that shape so well integrated into the body of it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that, like, kink, we kind of think of like, oh, it's got to be like the shaping of the bodywork or the way that like the hips of the fenders are. And it's like, no, it's essentially like the window trim shape. It's kind of like how it shapes the C-pillar on the car.
You can kind of think of it as, those German designers and their windows, they kind of had a little fetish for this. So they call it the Hofmeister kink.
That's a terrible joke. I was going to make the joke of like, oh, do you think that the camback design is going to make a comeback?
Oh, yeah. I'll take the kink joke. I don't know. But yeah, there's probably other things in the BMW world that extend out from there, or other European cars, since they seem to be at the forefront of this design.
Yeah, there's a lot of designs that have come out of Europe. It seems like, the Europeans are a little bit more artsy. Like, the only thing that we talked about from the American side, a Continental kit, was a ripoff of the European designs.
It's true. And there's probably other ones like that, right? In Britain, they came up with this kind of vehicle, which was a horse-drawn carriage at the time, and they used it for like wealthy, aristocratic people to go on these hunting parties. And so they'd bring their long guns along with them, and along with the rest of their equipment, they would have this thing called a brake, which was a chassis that they used to break in wild horses, apparently. I'd never heard of that in my life. I didn't know what was. A brake for horses?
Yeah, it seems like, like horse-drawn carriages, right, would, I guess, be used, or like a common term is like it's a brake. It's, just the chassis or the carriage being drawn behind horses was a brake. And then, so if you think about it, if we needed to carry a bunch of people out to like a hunting party,
Right.
it would be the shooting brake of this is the
Oh.
carriage designed to be able to haul a bunch of people with their guns to go out and do a hunting party. So the term shooting brake, which we know very commonly now as car enthusiasts of like the really cool, it's not a hatchback, it's not a wagon, it's very specifically a shooting brake design, that comes from, you know, the name of what the horse-drawn carriage was to go do hunting parties. And so it was a reiteration of that design of like, okay, if I had a sports car and I needed to carry my long guns to go do a hunting party, I need a shooting brake design for my car.
That's really interesting because if you think about the dimensions of a car versus a long gun, right? There's probably a lot of cars you couldn't fit them in. You like need to hang them out the window or something.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, shooting brake back in the day was a carriage outfitted to handle guns, dogs, and go out and do a shooting party. So like the reiteration of like, I need to carry guns in my sports car, which seems like a ridiculous thing to do, be like, oh, well, that iteration, if we wanted to make it outfitted to carry guns and dogs and things like that, well, it's a shooting brake.
Yeah, and enthusiasts seem to love shooting brakes. Like anytime on the forums or you hear people talking about shooting brakes, they're just like frothing over with excitement, like, oh man, it's a shooting brake. And you see so few of these. You wonder, like, where's all that excitement coming from? I mean, they do exist.
It seems like it's just like the oddity. Like us as car enthusiasts, we love the thing that like, I guess somewhat doesn't make any sense. Like for me, at least, a shooting brake is a two-door wagon. Like
Yeah.
that, I think that's the best way to describe it because it's like a hatchback, it's kind of plump, it's not really sexy, it's not really drawn out. Where like a shooting brake, for me at least, has to have like a long nose to it and then that long roof, but none of them are four doors. So it's
Right.
not like the station wagon we normally think about.
Yeah.
It's a two-door wagon in a sense.
Yeah, and it doesn't have that notch back, right, where the trunk has a flat surface over it. It's more like the hatchback that way, but not so swooping. And with enough space or you know, cargo area that you could literally lay down some long guns in their cases inside.
Which is hilarious. And I think that's why us as car enthusiasts love it so much is like, it's just a ridiculous concept. Like, no one's actually using these vehicles, a shooting brake designed Aston Martin or Ferrari or whatever else to go out into the countryside and go shooting. No one's doing that. And I think that's like why we think it's so cool. And like, I think there's other obscurity within car culture of like, it's cool because it's weird and it's one off and you would never do it.
Yeah.
And it's just like that thing that like everyone just knows is cool.
Right. And there are a couple models of these, right? The ones you mentioned, the Ferrari FF or GTC4 Lusso is well known. There was that Aston Martin variation, the Zagato one that they had put out.
So sick.
Oh, dude. And it literally had the cases for the guns like in the back. It was really well done. There's a few that are unexpected that are shooting brakes that we don't really think of that way. Do you remember the old Volvo 1800?
No.
Oh, man. So look up the Volvo 1800. It's a really good looking car. It was from, I want to say, the early 1970s. And you've seen them around on the road, especially if you're in the Bay Area. I think they were popular as like old hippie cars. You probably see them a lot in like Marin County and places like that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this thing's sick.
Right. Really great design lines. And I want to say it was one of those Italian designers like from Pininfarina or somebody who was involved in the Carmen Ghia thing who was helping to design that.
Yeah, and so like I can see there's like the coupe version of this Volvo.
Right.
But there's also the wagon version, which you're right. It's like it's a two-door up front, and then it's just got that long side glass, beautiful lines, extended roof line, and then the rear hatch is like 80% glass. You know,
Absolutely.
like it's an incredible, incredible design, and I can see where Volvo in the modern era, the C30, which is their hatchback,
Yeah.
I can see where they got that rear hatch design
Totally.
from this old style.
And Mr. BMW, I'm going to blow your mind. There is a very well-known shooting brake within the lineup of BMWs, of course, from the E36 times, which was the Z3M Coupe, also known as the Shoe.
Yeah, I guess we could count that as a shooting brake. Like, and once again, what is the M Coupe? Is it a coupe? Is it a hatchback? Is it a wagon? Is it a shooting brake? No one knows, right? It's basically essentially it's a hardtop convertible. That's
Right.
That's what it was. Like that's what they made it to be. And then they just had a little bit more usability because it had that hatchback design. But I think shooting brake is probably the best thing to describe for the M Coupe. This is funny because I just recently went to Wagon Fest here. It happened in Marin County at Strawberry, and I had a buddy who had an M Coupe and one of kind of the early generations with the S52, the E36 motor that's in it. And I remember he emailed the organizers to be like, hey, I have this M Coupe. am I allowed to be in Wagon Fest? Does it count? And it did. They accepted him in, but I remember like we were standing by his car and there'd be people walking by and they're like, what the hell is this M Coupe doing here? This thing isn't a wagon. It doesn't count. Get all these non-wagon cars out of here. There was also, in the lineup of Wagon Fest, there was the Ford Flex,
Oh, my.
which I guess that counts as a wagon. But is that an SUV?
I don't know.
Another interesting vehicle. It's definitely not a shooting brake, but
Yeah, I'm not sure where you would put that exactly. But there's also something that's sort of like combative about this name. Like we hear shooting, we think of guns. It's somehow cool and edgy because this car has facility for that. Like, so we're all into it. Let's go, and maybe there's other things like that, like we gravitate to because they seem, like aggressive or whatever those other attributes are that we affiliate with cars and driving and the names of things or parts.
yeah, and that's the thing is like all these like terms, they come from somewhere. And within automotive culture, there are things within cars, whether that's parts or design or safety features, that they have interesting names. And most of them maybe we take for granted of like, yeah, that's just called a this, and we don't really think about it. And I think we've had great examples so far in the design category of automobiles of like, yeah, what is this called? Why is it called that? Where does the origination come from? But like it gets weirder when we get into parts.
Yeah, back when we talked about the 24 Hour of Le Mans history and the 1955 Le Mans race, the Mercedes Curse episode, we learned about a guy by the name of John Fitch. And John Fitch was so affected by what he saw at the race and just the needless loss of life that had occurred, he dedicated the rest of his life, in addition to continuing to race, to road safety for passenger cars, not even just for racing. And his invention were those giant yellow barrels that you see along the highway and usually, where there's a dividing point or by toll booths or something like that. It's a way to prevent people from making a head-on collision into a particular area. And they're generally arranged in these arrays, like you'll see them in a sort of an arrowhead shape or a triangular shape. And something I didn't know about is the barrels are ordered in increasing weight. So the ones in the front are the lightest ones, but as they continue to bang into the ones further and further along, they're a little heavier. So the idea is that it's going to help to dampen the impact and enable some deceleration to occur versus just a hard stop slamming into a hard wall or something.
That makes sense. I know what you're talking about, like those bright yellow barrels that you see like highways up against like Armco, or even like if you're going, a divide in the interstate, you'll see those barrels kind of laid out as the road divides if there's going to be a cement wall or something like that coming up.
Yeah.
That way you don't hit just a hard, immovable object.
That's right. And most of us, hopefully, fortunately, haven't ever had an impact with a Fitch barrel. But you have to kind of wonder, like, what's in those things? Because they're a variable weight and they're on the side of the road. And so whatever's in them has to be pretty plentiful and it can't be worth anything. Otherwise, people would steal it, right? So they fill them with concrete sand, basically, the dust off of concrete. And in freezing areas, they add rock salt just so that this mixture, if it gets wet,
it doesn't like
turn into
solidify.
cement. Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine this thing that's supposed to prevent bad collision from being worse turns into concrete in the barrels? Not so good.
And I've seen it on racetracks too. Like they'll use it as kind of a barrier for pit entrance and stuff like that. We had that one example of going over like weird incidences that have occurred in NASCAR or with pace cars.
Yes.
And one of the pace cars ended up hitting the Fitch barrels coming down into pit road, didn't quite make the entrance. And I remember it exploded the barrels and it was just a complete mess because the sand that was inside of it just went everywhere and they had to clean it all up.
It's kind of crazy. And all that was motivated by this guy who was racing and saw what could go wrong when you had insufficient protections for spectators, for other racers at a racetrack. And he applied that to the public roads, which I thought was a really cool extension of what he knew and cared about and really benefited everybody else too.
No, absolutely. And it's cool to see, that motorsport background going into just general public safety. And it kind of makes sense that the barrels got to be named after him, of him coming up with the idea and implementing this thing and paying homage and respect to the individual that was able to develop it. Now, in contrast, in the same category of a safety device that was implemented for roadway safety, but being named after someone for, I would say, the wrong reason, or the reason you wouldn't want something named after you, would be the Mansfield bar.
Yeah, more in memoriam than in honor of the inventor here.
Right.
Yeah, so Jane Mansfield was an actress in the 1950s and 60s, very famous bombshell blonde actress. The kind of girl was on posters in guys' bedrooms, right? So that's who Jane Mansfield was. And so she was very well known and a hugely popular figure. You could imagine of that day, like Marilyn Monroe, and she's among those that group of people. So like you could think of the equivalents of those today. So in 1967, Jane Mansfield was driving along with some other passengers in her car and her family, and had a collision into the back of a semi-tractor trailer, and all of the front passengers were killed on impact, and the story goes as they were beheaded.
Oof.
In the rear seat, there were passengers, which I believe were her kids. They all survived. So it was recognized that it's a really big problem for the way trucks are designed, that they have this rigid structure that ends just around the height of passenger cars, such that if there is an impact, the passenger car goes underneath the truck and then is stopped suddenly by this wall of steel. And we need to do something about that to protect that. So there is this heavy steel bar that you'll see hanging from the rear of semi-trucks. If you look, there's usually reflective stickers on it as well, red and white stickers. They're also known as ICC bars when there was an organization called the Interstate Commerce Commission. Today, this is mandated by NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the U.S. They're called underride guards, and effectively it's that bar that crosses the back of the truck that you see. And today, those are called Mansfield bars.
Because of the infamous incident that occurred
with Jane Mansfield.
Which there wasn't a Mansfield bar in that instance.
That's correct. But after the fact, those have now been mandated, and you'll see that on every truck out on the public roads.
See, it's interesting of like these things that are just kind of like in plain sight that you might not know, like, yeah, there's a word for that, and there's an incident that occurred that provoked this to come into creation. And I'm sure with semi-trucks too, there's like bars on the sides of them too, because like if you T-boned a semi-truck trailer, you might have a similar effect, and there's bars down there as well to be able to stop vehicles from going underneath it. But yeah, not the best way to have something named after you of being the example for the new rule.
Right. Let's talk about things that are maybe a little bit lighter in that. There's things that we have all the time or we use that have names that we just don't know the names of. We just take for granted, right? One of those really obvious things is a Schrader valve. So a Schrader valve is a pneumatic tire valve, like you see on almost all tires, where there's a spring and a threaded stem, just like you think of a valve stem on a tire. That's called a Schrader valve. And the way it works is there's a little pin inside. So if you use your air chuck or the nozzle of your pump, pushes that pin down, and there's an internal spring. So it opens the valve and allows air or whatever liquid or refrigerant or something to enter that area. And as soon as you remove the pressure from that pin, the spring extends and it closes the valve. So that's how a tire keeps air inside, and that's how you can actually add air to your tire.
So something that we've dealt with a lot of times, but probably never knew the name of.
Yeah, Schrader valve. And apparently there's a specialized version of this they use on bicycles that they call a Presta valve.
Interesting.
Yeah, bikers got to be different.
We don't need to talk about the spandex individuals.
No. Next. Well, what else you got? What are some obscure car parts? What are parts of a car that you rely upon, that you appreciate, that maybe not everybody knows about?
Well, I think we should move on to the discussion of why there's a lot of things named after dog in automobiles. Of like, this isn't just one thing, it's many things. There's dog rings, dog teeth, dog box, and dog leg.
Yeah, I guess, hey, I'm a big dog fan. I would try to name anything I could after dog. I would have called him Husky Leg or Husky Gear or Husky Teeth or something like that,
Which it's funny of like, yeah, we have the dog's teeth as well as the dog's leg. Like, why was the dog the animal of reference to be like, hey, this kind of looks like that?
Well, we had horsepower, but that's all we took from horses.
Well, and we had carriages, so that led into the shooting brake. So in terms of these things named after dogs that are in our cars, the first one is the dog leg transmission. Now, this is unique, right? This isn't in every car, but what a dog leg transmission is the orientation of the gears in a manual transmission, meaning where first, second, third, fourth, and fifth gears located,
right?
Sixth, seventh, however many gears you have in your manual transmission. But a dog leg transmission changes the location of where first gear is. So for our usual manual transmission users, drivers, First gear is usually to the left and up, right? That's the location for first gear. Then second is straight down. Third is up and to the right.
Yeah, this is what we think of like as an H pattern.
H pattern, normal H pattern transmission. Now a dogleg transmission changes where first gear is, and it's actually to the left and down. That's where your first gear is going to be located. And then second gear is going to be up and in the middle. Then third gear is straight down from second. Fourth gear is up to the right. And then fifth gear is straight down from there.
Interesting. I'll bet this was good for motorsports, right? Because you think about how infrequently you ever use first gear in a race car. Like that's just to get out rolling. And so now if you're just, 2 to 3 was a vertical to, it's just a vertical pull.
Yes.
Right? How much easier that is. And you're doing 2 to 3 to 2 to 3 to 2 to 3, like constantly in a race.
Yeah, exactly. That was the 100% the mindset behind it was like, hey, put first gear kind of off to the side. Like, you might be thinking to yourself, like, hey, that's a little awkward, like to the left and down. Like, that might be difficult to find or remember or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but like for a race car, a performance car, how often are you using first gear? Maybe once during the session just to get out of pit lane.
Right.
And then from there, you're primarily going to be using second, third, fourth, maybe even fifth gear.
Right.
And so now that puts those gears, those more used to or easier to get to locations. And so, like, there have been street cars that have had dogleg transmissions, kind of taking that motorsport origin and applying it to a street car. And so, like, for people that have to get into a car that has a dogleg layout, they might not be used to finding where that first gear is located, and they might, start the car in second more often than not.
Think about that muscle memory you use when you're driving a manual. I can imagine, like, you go to shift and you think you're in one gear and you're actually in another. You can wind up in a lot of trouble. I sort of associate this in my mind with vintage cars. Is there anything more modern that uses this, or is it all kind of older cars?
It's all going to be older cars. I can't think of anything. I mean, the manual is dying as we know it anyway. So there's not that many, what I would say, modern cars that I could come up with examples of having a dogleg transmission. Some of the old iconic ones, the BMW M3 E30 had a dogleg for the street cars, the Lamborghini Countach, the Ford GT40, Ferrari Testarossa. The most modern one that I can think of is with the Aston Martin V12 Vantage S.
Mm-hmm.
It had a dogleg 7-speed manual transmission.
That's killer. And I guess considers to be a double H pattern at that point.
Right. And if you think about like a 7-speed manual gearbox in a normal configuration, it'd be weird. Like be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7's all the way over to the right and up.
And nothing below it.
And nothing below it. So if you get first gear out of the way first, and then it's kind of like your first gear gets you into then now a normal H pattern for a 6-speed.
Interesting.
But now you have a 7th gear.
I guess they did a Vantage AMR in 2020 that also had that same 7-speed dogleg.
Oh, interesting. So I guess Aston Martin's kind of the last one carrying the flag for the dogleg transmission.
Yeah, carrying it like a bowl in their mouth.
Well, and with this, like, a lot of people get confused between dogleg transmission and dog box. And those are two very, very different things.
Yeah, let's talk about a dog box. There's dogleg transmission and dog box, which also refers to the transmission, but it's a different kind. So the dog box is, I think, if I could say, equivalent to what we call the gearbox.
Right, and because the dog leg is more just the orientation for the shifter for the transmission. And we didn't really mention, why do they call it a dog leg? All that we could find was like it looked like a dog's leg where first gear was located because it kind of curved down and to the left.
Kind of bent back the way a dog would sit or something. I don't know. It's sort of tenuous, but it's what we got.
It seemed like a stretch.
Yeah. Well, how about the dogs themselves or the dog box and why it's called that?
Right. So, yeah, the dog box, once again, that's the transmission style is different. And the reason why it's called a dog box transmission is because the gears in the transmission have dog teeth.
Which is to say that they're straight cut gears versus tapered or angled gears, which would allow for a more gradual sort of interleaving so that the synchros could smoothly move you from gear to gear.
Right.
Which is in a dog box, that is a transmission with straight cut gears that we call dogs because they look like dog teeth. It's slam into place. It's not a gradual or kind of soft interleaving.
Right. So, yeah, the biggest kind of identifier of the dog box transmission is that those gears have teeth on them that look reminiscent of canine teeth. They're basically just straight up. They're not curved. They're not meant to be meshed really smoothly together. They present the opportunity to be able to slam the gears together. And that's kind of the iconic style of shifting a dog box transmission, is that it doesn't use synchros. You almost don't even need a clutch. When the transmission is going and you're up to speed and the vehicle's moving, you can essentially just slam it from one gear to the next, and those dog teeth allow for spacing that you can just jam the gears together and they'll find the space to mesh together. Where in contrast, a normal transmission, the gearing does have these like kind of twisted splines, and you need synchros to synchronize the speeds to mesh them smoothly together.
Right. So it's a little bit of tolerance in the dog box that allows the dog teeth to sort of slam into place and not miss the gear,
Right.
but actually like fall into place. And I know when I've pulled a shift on a car that had a dog box, like when I was driving the sequential manual on the Formula 3 cars, man, you feel that ka-chunk when it hits gear. You just ka-chunk into gear. And then while you're out there driving, the dynamics of the dog box are such that the engagement and disengagement of the gears requires you to manage that. So on an upshift, there's a quick lift of the throttle required because you have to unload the gear so that the gears could actually come back together and fit. And if you didn't lift, there's no way that that stationary gear is going to find its position of where to jam into in the other gear that's still turning.
Yeah. Which this conversation of like, what do you mean? Like, I could have a manual transmission that I don't have to use the clutch and I can just jam it into gear and like click the next gear.
Yes.
Why don't we all have that? Like, a dog box sounds sick. Why don't we have dog boxes in normal day cars?
So I've been in cars with racing instructors who insist that no car on the road really needs you to use the clutch. Now, I also know that a lot of those instructors, racing drivers, drive cars a certain way because it's not theirs. And so I'm not sure you want to take their advice about driving your manual car without its clutch, but that's not to say that it couldn't be done without incurring damage.
Yeah, I mean, like, cars that have synchros, normal transmissions, there's a certain RPM that it's going to go into the next gear. You can kind of bypass the synchros. But why can't I have it like dog boxes? We talked about dog leg transmissions, and there's examples of road-going cars that come with dog legs. But for the most part, road-going cars don't come with dog boxes. Why not? Why don't production cars come with dog box transmissions with dog gear transmission gears?
Yeah, well, given that they don't have a smooth way to engage, at particularly low speeds, the things are kind of miserable to drive. Like in slow traffic, which you're in a lot in a passenger car, this thing would be juddering and really hard to engage and modulate speed, and you'd have very poor precision over it.
Oh.
They are also really loud. So the design of these gears makes a loud whining noise at speed. There's just something about the way that they engage with each other that makes that noise. And then, of course, they wear more quickly than a synchroed transmission with spline gears because these very sudden and abrupt shifts that are occurring are causing the gear teeth to slam into the place where they recess. Then there's some movement of that. So metal on metal and high impact over and over again is going to create more wear.
Gotcha. So the way that a dog box transmission works, it like to be able to slam the gears together, the dog teeth of the gears, there needs to be a little bit of play, right? I would assume. And so like at low speed, I would assume that those gears together, like there'd be a little like clunking or like a juk, 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 like if you're not on or off throttle precisely, like if you're in the interim just trying to cruise, the transmission's not going to be happy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, at higher speeds, you're going to start getting that whine. Now this makes a lot more sense because every time I've driven a Porsche Cup car and you try to get out of pit lane, one, the transmission in a Porsche Cup car, loudest thing you'll ever hear. You can barely hear the motor over the transmission. But it's like when you're trying to get out and you're like in that interim of like a little bit of throttle pressure, no throttle pressure, and it just goes and like you get in this like rodeo like kick back and forth. Now that makes sense. It's just the dog gears having a little bit of slack.
And when you see a lot of race cars pulling out of pit lane, especially with a less experienced driver who might not have that finesse with getting away, there's a lot of that ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk at low speed until they finally get into the next gear.
So dog boxes are only good for cars where it's like you're under load all the time. You're full throttle or no throttle. It's a performance application.
And that's not to say people don't try to do a mod to their street car. Like I read about a guy with the 240SX who put a dog box in his street car. But I mean, like at that point, you're just asking for trouble. You're making your car harder to drive. You think you're getting performance that you'd never need on the street. It's just a strange idea.
Yeah, the most common places I've heard of like dog boxes is one NASCAR, so like the old
Mhm.
H pattern, which is still in the O'Reilly series, but it
Right.
used to be in the Cup series too. It's like they have dog box transmissions, and if you watch them race, they're not using the clutch on the upshifts. They'll just blip the throttle like you're talking about, slam the next gear, and then on the downshifts, on the brakes, blip a little throttle, still no clutch, and
Right.
then jamming the gear back in. And then the other place is like drift cars. Like drift cars use dog boxes because
Mhm.
the simplicity of the transmission, they can take these big forces, high horsepower, stuff like that without, having any issues with the synchros or splitting apart gears or whatever. So those are the main two that I've ever heard of dog box.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who are maybe unfamiliar with this idea of rev matching, of why you need to do that,
Yeah.
it starts to make more sense when you think about, spinning gears that need to interact together and you need to have them interlock. Well, matching the speeds is going to be a lot easier to get them to connect to each other than if they're spinning at wildly different speeds.
Great dive into the engineering of what's going on in your car, which I'm
So
sure
good.
everyone wants to know about. So
There's so much
intensely.
of this stuff, man. Cars have a lot of history, and there's a lot of terms like you never hear anymore, but they're fun and they're cool, and they're kind of associated with car history. Like when you hear old songs in the 60s and 70s and 80s about cars, because there were so many of those, because it was such an important part of culture, you'll hear these references. And I remember hearing about four on the floor, and I had no idea what that meant. And then later, I learned that there was something called three on the tree. Do you know what that is?
This is good rhyming schemes. This might have predated my time of a license.
On the earth, yes. So back in the old days, most cars were manual transmissions, as we know. And so there was a shifter, like a shift lever that you had to push into place. And generally those are on the floor of the car, right? That's where they're located. On some cars, they're maybe a little closer up to the dash, but they're based on the floor. And most cars, for a long time, until let's say the 1970s or 80s, were 3 or 4 speed cars, right?
Only.
Transmissions didn't really come in 5 or 6 or 7
and that's why it was
speed.
called an H pattern.
That's why it was called an H pattern, and that's the 4 were the gears that you had, 1, 2, 3, and if there was a 4, you had 4 gears, shifter on the floor of the car. Predating that still, there was a 3-speed gearbox, and this is kind of hard to get your head around. If you've seen old cars, especially old American cars, the transmission selector is not on the floor. It's connected to the steering wheel. So it comes off of the steering shaft like the turn signals or the wiper controls.
Yeah, it's on the column.
Yeah, on the column on the steering wheel itself is this transmission shifter where you go from park to reverse or whatever. Well, back in the day, they used that not just for automatic transmissions to go from park to reverse to drive. They used that for manual transmissions such that first gear, second gear, third gear were pulling that lever that was sticking out of the steering column.
That seems so overly complicated because the transmission selector, the stick shift, it being on the ground makes sense because that's where the transmission is, right?
That's right.
It's right underneath there, so you're just changing the linkages and moving it around. Now, if you put it up on the steering column, that seems like we're adding a lot of complexity for the old days.
If you think about it, they were actually way ahead of their time because with technology, where did we put the transmission selector now?
Are we talking about paddle shifts?
Yeah, they're on the steering wheel, so you don't have to remove your hands from the wheel to shift.
And back then, was it also because the automatic selector was already up there? So people are used to being up close to the steering wheel, so let's put the manual transmission up there too?
This probably predated the automatic transmission, would be my guess. I don't know for sure.
3 on the tree?
3 on the tree. And the tree, of course, because the steering column has a bunch of stuff sticking out of it, like the turn signals and the wiper selectors or whatever other controls might have been there. I mean, some cars even have the horn off of the side of the thing.
Yeah.
So the last cars that were made with 3 on the tree were in 1979, the Chevy Nova, and this is an overlap, I think like a multi-brand, multi-badge deal, Pontiac Ventura, Oldsmobile Omega, and the Pontiac Phoenix in 1979 were all still rocking this design. All the way until 1987, there were American production vehicles, trucks, that still offered a 3 on the tree manual transmission. It was the Chevy C and K class and the GMC Sierra C-Series pickups from 1987.
Interesting. So it had a pretty good lifespan. I looked up why would you have a 3 on the tree? Why did the manufacturers develop a transmission selector on the column? And the main reasons that manufacturers did this was 1, more cabin space. So rather than having the 4 on the floor, it took up space that you could have storage and things like that. So
Oh,
you
you
moved the shifter up.
You probably had a passenger there. Everybody had bench seats.
Oh, that's right.
I didn't even
Yeah.
think of
It'd make
that.
it a lot easier and then it says cost and simplicity. So my idea of thinking that this was overly complicated of like putting it up there, I guess it was easier. It was actually cheaper. It was often cheaper to build 3 on the tree than a floor mounted shifters.
Oh, man.
So it was a budget friendly feature, which I was like, there's no way. And then it also said safety and convenience. It was designed to keep the driver's hands relatively close to the steering wheel while changing gears, just like you were saying. So
Hey, look at that.
So interesting. It didn't really take off, right? Like now when we think about manual transmissions, the standard is like the shifters in basically the center console.
Right.
But it's interesting that like it had its heyday of the shifter up on the column, which I would agree with you. The modern day rendition is now that we have the paddles.
Yeah.
The paddles are on the steering wheel. That's kind of like, well, I guess it's 2. So what is that? Two on the shoe? No, that doesn't make any sense.
2 on the, I don't know. We'll have to come up with something for that. And I guess at the same time as we're improving this so that people don't have to remove their hands from the wheel, and then we went and put all the controls in some touchscreen 3 menus deep, and now all of the benefit of that kind of has gone away.
Unless you have a Ferrari, then all of your buttons are on the steering wheel.
Haptic, and they
Which
don't
now
work
they're
half the
haptic.
time.
So now, we're back to screens. Now it's a screen on the steering wheel.
Oh, man, there's so many of these. I think these kind of conversations make me ask the why questions. Why do we do it this way? Why is it named that? Why can't it be like this? And there's so much cool history of automobiles and highways and infrastructure and just transportation and all this stuff. And it's really cool to learn about it. And then we come to the modern era and we say, oh, they were onto something back then that then they lost, and now we're back to, whether it's keeping your hands on the steering wheel or whatever it is. So it's just kind of cool to see how these things cycle or how we can benefit by paying attention to our history a little bit.
Well, thanks for the conversation, Todd.
Hey, thanks, Silas. I'm just glad we didn't talk about petcock.
That might be for a future episode. So thanks for listening, and listen for that one.
Have a good one, everybody. Thanks for listening.
This has been Cold Start.